And welcome back, everybody. Shalom, peace be unto everyone. Sister Chaya, back with the book When God Was a Woman. We are starting at chapter 4. If you didn't get to listen to the first part, it's in the video list. Okay, let me share my screen. All right, so chapter 4, the Northern Invaders. Why and when the more northern tribes came to choose a male deity is a moot question. In their earliest development, they left neither tablets nor temples. It is only upon their arrival in the goddess worshiping communities of the Near and Middle East, which by that time had developed into thriving urban centers, that they come to our attention. The lack of evidence for earlier cultural centers in their northern homelands of Russia and the Caucasus region, just previous to the invasions, suggests that up until their arrival in the Near and Middle East, they may still have been nomadic hunting and fishing groups, possibly shepherds just beginning to practice agriculture. These northern peoples are referred to in various contexts as Indo-Europeans, Indo-Iranians, Indo-Aryans, or simply Aryans. Their existence, once it surfaced in historical periods, portrays them as aggressive warriors riding two abreast in horse-drawn war chariots. Their earlier, more speculative appearances in prehistoric times as big sailors who navigated the rivers and coastlines of Europe and the Near East. Discussing their origins, Hawkes writes of the Mesolithic and Neolithic groups known as the battle axe cultures, telling us that on no subject have authorities differed so completely or with greater lack of objectivity than on the origins of these cultures. The reason for this partisanship lies in the one thing the authorities are agreed upon, that the battle axe cultures represent the roots of the Indo-European speaking peoples. What can be said with some certainty is that the battle axe people had a large ethnic, social, and cultural inheritance from the hunter-fishers of the forest cultures, such as the Maglemosian and Kunda. Though it may not always or everywhere have been so, this character came in time to be dominantly pastoral, patriarchal, warlike, and expansive. These Maglemosian and Kunda people of Mesolithic times, about 15,000 to 8,000 BC, were generally located in the forest and coastal areas of northern Europe, most especially in Denmark. Their sites were generally further north than those of the earlier Gravesian Argnasian groups who left us the heritage of the Venus figures. The invasion by the northern peoples was not a single major event, but rather a series of migrations which took place in waves over a period of at least 1,000 and possibly 3,000 years. The invasions of the historical period, which began at about 2400 BC, are attested by literature and surviving artifacts and are agreed upon by most historians and archaeologists. Those of prehistoric times are speculative, based upon suggestive evidence and etymological connections. These earlier and less extensive invasions would take us back to 4000 to 3000 BC, thus taking place before the time of written records. They are not generally associated with the same invading tribes, yet on the basis of the evidence that does appear, I feel that they should be mentioned along with the more attested periods, so that the reader may draw her or his own conclusions. What is most significant is that in historic times, the northern invaders viewed themselves as a superior people. This attitude seems to have been based primarily upon their ability to conquer the more culturally developed earlier settlers, the people of the goddess. The Indo-Europeans were in continual conflict not only with the people whose lands they invaded, but between themselves as well. The pattern that surfaces in each area in which they make an appearance is that of a group of aggressive warriors accompanied by a priestly caste of high standing who initially invaded, conquered, and then ruled the indigenous population of each land they entered. The dates given for their original appearance in the Near East vary. Professor James suggests that the Indo-Europeans were established on the Iranian plateau by the 4th millennium. The curators of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England, date their entry into Anatolia at the late 4th millennium or early part of the 3rd. Professor Albright suggests their appearance in Anatolia at not later than the early 3rd millennium, while Professor Seton Lloyd writes in about 2300 BC, a great wave of Indo-European peoples speaking a dialect known as Luwian seem to have swept over Anatolia. Professor Gordon tells us that Indo-Europeans appear on the Near East scene shortly after 2000 BC. While their chief representatives are the Hittites, the Mitannian kings and gods often bear Indo-European names. The Iranian plateau was to become a great stamping ground of the Aryans, as we may call the segment of the Indo-Europeans to which the Iranians belong. Gordon elaborates further, explaining that the influx of the Indo-European immigrants into the Near East during the 2nd millennium BC revolutionized the art of war. The newcomers introduced the horse-drawn war chariot, which gave a swift striking power hitherto unknown in the Near East. The elite charioteer officers, who bear the Indo-European name of Marianu, soon became a new aristocracy throughout the entire area, including Egypt. So this is mapped to the location of the areas discussed. From Anatolia and Iran, these tribes continued to push southward into Mesopotamia and Canaan, according to Professor Albright. There is both archaeological and documentary evidence pointing to a great migratory movement or movements from the northeast into Syria in the 18th century BC. As a result of this movement, Hurrian and Indo-Iranian tribes flooded the country. By the 15th century, we find most of eastern and northern Syria occupied predominantly by Hurrians and Indo-Iranians. Megiddo, Jerusalem, and Ascalon, all in Canaan, are ruled by princes with Anatolian or Indo-Iranian names. The cranial type at Megiddo, which was previously Mediterranean in character, now becomes brachycephalic, alpine. As the invasions were sporadic, they are difficult to follow and would probably require a volume on each particular area over a long period of time to be thoroughly explained. But historical, mythological, and archaeological evidence suggests that it was these northern people who brought with them the concepts of light as good and dark as evil, very possibly the symbolism of their racial attitudes toward the darker people of the southern areas, and of a supreme male deity. The emergence of the male deity in their subsequent literature, which repeatedly describes and explained his supremacy and the extremely high position of their priestly caste, may perhaps allow these invasions to be viewed as religious crusade wars as much as territorial conquest. The arrival of the Indo-Aryan tribes, the presentation of their male deities as superior to the female deities of the indigenous populations of the lands they invaded, and the subsequent intricate interlacing of the two theological concepts are recorded mythologically in each culture. It is in these myths that we witness the attitudes that led to the suppression of goddess worship. As Sheila Collins writes, theology is ultimately political. The way human communities deify the transcendent and determine the categories of good and evil have more to do with the power dynamics of the social systems which create the theologies than with the spontaneous revelation of truth from another quarter. Judging from the production of religious mythology of the royal scribes and priests found in the archives of palaces of the Indo-European ruled nations of the historic periods, often in the language of the conquered populations, we may surmise that political aims rather than religious fervor may well have been the motivation. The prevalence of myths that explain the creation of the universe by the male deity or the institution of kingship, when none had existed previously, strongly hints at the possibility that many of these myths were written by priests of the invading tribes to justify the supremacy of the new male deities and to justify the installation of a king as the result of the relationship of that king to the male deity. The Indo-European male deity, unlike the sun, lover of the goddess religion, was most often portrayed as a storm god, high on a mountain, blazing with the light of fire or lightning. This recurrent symbolism suggests that these northern people may once have worshipped volcanoes as manifestations of their god, a factor I will discuss more thoroughly in chapter 5. In some areas, this god was annexed to the goddess as a husband, such as the storm god Taru and the sun goddess of Arena or Zeus and Hera. In some legends, he emerged as a rebellious young man who heroically destroyed the older female deity, at times upon the previously assured promise of supremacy in the divine hierarchy. In many of these myths, the female deity is symbolized as a serpent or dragon, most often associated with darkness and evil. At times, the gender of the dragon seems to be neuter or even a male, closely associated with his mother or wife, who is the goddess. But the plot and the underlying symbolic theme of the story is so similar in each myth that, judging from the stories that do use the name of the female deity, we may surmise that the allegorical identity of the dragon or serpent is that of the goddess religion. The goddess, the original supreme deity of the people conquered and ruled by the invading Indo-Europeans, was not ignored, but was symbolically included in such a manner that these supposedly religious myths allow us to trace her eventual deposition. The male deity is invariably the powerful champion of light. With slight variations, we find the myth in Hittite Anatolia in the battle between the storm god and the dragon Illuyankas. In India, between Indra, lord of the mountains, and the goddess Danu and her son Vrtra. In northern Canaan, between Baal, who plays a dual role as the storm god of Mount Saphon, as well as the brother consort of the goddess Anath, and the serpent Lotan and Lautan. In the Canaanite language, Lot means goddess. In Babylon, probably in the Indo-European period of Kassite control, between Marduk and goddess Tiamat, in Indo-European Mytian-controlled Assyria, Ashur simply assumes the deeds of Marduk. In Indo-European Greece, between Zeus and the serpent Typhon, son of the goddess Gaia, between Apollo and the serpent Python, also recorded as the son of Gaia, and between Hercules and the serpent Ladon, who guards the sacred fruit tree of the goddess Hera, said to be given to her by Gaia at the time of her marriage to Zeus. The myth appears in the ancient Hebrew writings, whose connections to the Indo-Europeans shall also be thoroughly discussed in chapter 5, as the conquest by the Hebrew god Yahweh or Jehovah of the serpent Leviathan, another Canaanite name for Lotan. It may even survive in the legends of Saint George and the dragon and Saint Patrick and the snakes. The female religion, especially after the earlier invasions, appears to have assimilated the male deities into the older worship, and the goddess survived as the popular religion of the people for thousands of years after the initial invasions. By the time of Marduk and Ashur of the 16th century BC, her position had been greatly lowered in Mesopotamia. But it was upon the last assaults by the Hebrews and eventually by the Christians for the first centuries after Christ that the religion was finally suppressed and nearly forgotten. It is in these accounts of the Indo-European people that we may find the origins of many of the ideas of the early Hebrews. The concept of the God on the mountaintop, blazing with light, the duality between light and dark symbolized as good and evil, the myth of the male deity's defeat of the serpent, as well as the leadership of a supreme ruling class, each so prevalent in Indo-European religion and society, are to be found in Hebrew religious and political concepts as well. This influence or possible connection with the Indo-European peoples may provide the explanation for the extreme patriarchal attitudes of the Hebrews, which will be thoroughly discussed in chapter 5, by first becoming aware of the Indo-European political patterns and religious imagery. Hebrew attitudes and ideas that were later adopted into Christianity may be better understood. India. Origin of the caste. In India, there is some of the clearest evidence of the Indo-Aryan invasions and the conquest of the original goddess-worshipping people. The language of the Indo-Aryans of India was what we today refer to as Sanskrit. Upon their arrival, the northern peoples did not yet possess a method of writing. They adopted two alphabets, possibly from the Akkadians. With these scripts, they wrote their hymns and other literature. Thus, the most comprehensive records of the Indo-Aryans in India were in the books known as the Vedas, written sometime between 1500 and 1200 BC in the Indo-European Sanskrit language using the borrowed scripts. In 1963, Professor E.O. James wrote, "It appears that the sky gods in the ancient Vedic pantheon were already established among the Aryan tribes when they began their migrations in the second millennium BC. On their arrival in India, they found, contrary to belief prior to the archaeological excavations in and around the Indus Valley since 1922, not a primitive aboriginal population, but a highly developed urban civilization superior to their own relatively simple way of life as depicted in the Rig Veda." Writing in 1965, Giuseppe Sormani also tells us that the Aryans came into contact with highly civilized and already ancient forms of settled society, in comparison with which they were mere barbarians. He also explains that they had long since abandoned matriarchy and had a patriarchal family system as well as a patriarchal form of government. According to the hymns in the Indo-Aryan Rigveda, in the very beginning of time, there was only Asura, living power. The Asura then broke down into two cosmic groups. One was the enemies of the Aryans, known as the Danavans or Dithyas, whose mother was the goddess Danu or Diti. The other group, clearly the heroes of the Aryans, were known to them as the Adithyas. This title betrays the fact that this mythical structure was created in reaction to the presence of the worshippers of Diti, since Aditya literally means not Dithyas, not people of Diti. This strongly suggests that these mythical hymns were not only written down after the Aryans came into contact with the goddess people, but were conceived and composed after that time as well. One of the major Indo-Aryan gods was known as Indra, Lord of the Mountains, he who overthrows cities. Upon obtaining the promise of supremacy, if he succeeding in killing Danu and her son Vitra, he does accomplish the act, thus achieving kingship among the Adityas. In a hymn to Indra in the Rig Veda, which describes the event, Danu and her son are first described as serpent demons. Later, as they lie dead, they are symbolized as cow and calf. Both images of cow and serpent are associated with the worship of the goddess as it was known in the Near and Middle East. After the murders, the cosmic waters flowed and were pregnant. They in turn gave birth to the sun. This concept of the sun god emerging from the primeval waters appears in other Indo-European myths and also occurs in connection with two of the prehistoric invasions. The Indo-Aryan attitude toward women is made clear in two sentences attributed to Indra in the Rig Veda. The mind of woman brooks not discipline. Her intellect has little weight. We may find this statement rather ironic in light of the level of the culture of the patriarchal male-worshipping Indo-Aryans compared with that of the more female-oriented goddess-worshipping people they forcibly subdued. The Rig Veda also refers to an ancestral father god known both as Prajapati and Dyaspitar. He appears as an almost abstract idea in the Rig Veda, yet Dyaspitar is known in later Brahmanic writings as supreme father of all. Evidence of ancestor worship of the father occurs in several hymns of the Rig Veda. The Indo-Aryans daily recited the Pitriyana, the worship of the ancestral fathers. In this ritual, the father of the family acted as high priest, later passing these rites on to his eldest son. In Sanskrit, Pitar means father, but Patai has various meanings. The connections assure us of the position of men in these northern tribes. Patai has the alternative translations of lord, ruler, master, owner, and husband. The spread of the Indo-Aryan culture brought with it the origins of the Hindu religion and the concept of light-colored skin being perceived as better than darker skins. The Brahmins, the priests of the lighter Indo-Aryans, were considered to be the epitome of the racial hierarchy. Sormani reports that much study has been given to the real origin of the caste, and the most dependable theories trace these back to the invasions of ancient times. The white-skinned Aryans did not wish to mingle with the dark-skinned Dravidians, who were the original inhabitants. The Sanskrit word for caste, or varna, means color. The first measures toward dividing the populations into castes were laws that forbade mixed marriages between Aryans and Dravidians. In the later Bhagavad Gita, the Aryan hero Arjuna speaks of his fear of undermining the very structure of society. His concern is that he might produce lawlessness, which is then described as meaning the corruption of women, which in turn would lead to caste mixture. A figure who appears in the Indo-Aryan mythology of 400 BC, though he may have been known in legend before that time, is Rama, who symbolizes the Brahmanic tradition. Norman Brown, professor of Sanskrit at the University of Pennsylvania, describes him in this way. Rama is the mythic agent for spreading Aryan, that is Brahmanic or Sanskrit culture, to the then un-Aryanized south of India, where even now culture is primarily a possession of the Brahmins overlying a substratum which is chiefly Dravidian. Rama's conquest is by force of arms. He is thus represented as having brought culture and light to the aborigines, whatever, who when intransigent are called demons, and when willing converts, monkeys and bears. Thus, it may have been that the patriarchal invaders who saw women as inferior are responsible for the origins of racist attitudes as well. Light to the Aryans may have been the blinding light of volcanic eruptions, later symbolized by the light of their ever-present fire sacrifices. The light of the astral bodies, especially the sun, the lightning bolts of their storm god, perhaps the lightness of their own skin color as compared with the Mediterranean people, and the realm of eternal light, where the spirits of the Aryan dead were supposed to reside. The gracious fathers dwell in glowing light, light primeval. Brahma, whose name eventually came to be that of the supreme God, is described as he whose form is light. Dev, the Sanskrit word for God, literally means shining or bright. Mithra, still another god who appears in the Rig Veda, later to emerge in a more important role in the Iranian Avesta, is continually associated with light, while Varuna, which seems to be another name of Dyaus, Pitar, has the task of performing daily sacrifices to bring the shining sun out of the deep, dark space under the earth. Archaeological evidence, especially the work of Sir John Marshall, reveals that before the Aryan invasions, the indigenous population of India revered the goddess. The earliest cultures of the Indus Valley seem to have been in contact with Sumer and Elam at about 3000 BC. Religious attitudes and beliefs are often firmly entrenched in family and social custom. If the major part of the population once held the goddess as sacred, it does not seem too surprising to find that these beliefs were revived at times when it was safe to do so openly, though we may find the time span rather astonishing. In later periods of Indian history, as many other areas where the worship of the male deity was superimposed upon the female religion, many people, perhaps those who remained in more isolated areas, still retained the worship of the goddess. As late as AD 600, the worship of the female divinity once again surfaced in India. She appeared in the Puranas and Tantras under many names, but the name Devi, simply meaning goddess, combined them all. Yet the name Devi was from the Sanskrit Dev. Her name as Danu or Diti had been forgotten. Professor Brown explains that the reason why we do not hear of her sooner, doubtless, is that the Great Mother is not Aryan in origin and was late in getting Brahmanic recognition. She is quite different from any of the female deities in the Rig Veda. The Great Mother Goddess is widely worshipped in India today in non-Aryan circles. In South India, every village has its collection of ammas, or mothers, and their worship is the chief religious exercise of the village. The priests of these deities, they have priestesses as well, are not Brahmins, but are members of lower caste, thus indicating the pre-Aryan or at least non-Aryan worship of these goddesses. Brown tells us that the goddess was eventually incorporated into Brahmanic literature, but points out that the Great Mother conception still has a dubious position in Brahmanic circles. Iran, the seed of the Aryan lands. Indo-Aryan beliefs are also found in the writings of Iran, though at a much later period. The oldest written material from Iran, unfortunately, dates back only as far as 600 BC to the Zend Avesta of Zarathustra. But this mythological material is enlightening, for as James explains, Indians and Iranians alike were, as we have seen, Aryans derived from the same Indo-European ethnological stock established on the Iranian plateau since the 4th millennium BC and apparently spoke a Vedic Sanskrit dialect. Professor M.J. Dresden also tells us that a substantial body of linguistic, religious, and social evidence warrants the assumption that at one time, the bearers of the two cultures, which find their expression in the Indian Rig Veda on the one hand and in parts of the Iranian Avesta on the other, formed a unity. Though there certainly must have been considerable change from the time of the Rig Veda until the writing of the Avesta, we again find the concept of a great father who represents light, now known as Ahura Mazda. He is generally referred to as the Lord of Light, and his abode is on a mountaintop, glowing in golden light. This dwelling is said to be on Mount Hara, supposedly the first mountain ever created. In the language of the Indo-Iranians, Hara actually meant mountain. The duality of light and dark as good and evil is everywhere evident in Iranian religious thought. Ahura Mazda is on high in goodness, while a devil-like figure called Ahriman is deep down in darkness. In one account, Ahriman dared to come up to the border between them, there to be blinded by the light of Ahura. Seeing valor and supremacy superior to his own, he fled back to the darkness. In the Iranian text of AD 200, known as Menician, once again we find good and evil equated with light and dark. In these statements, we are told that the problems of humanity are caused by the mixture of the two. Mithra, who appears in the Rig Veda, emerges more significantly in Iranian thought. Now it is Mithra who defeats the demons of darkness. Most interesting is the Iranian figure known as Gaio Mareta, the first man created. Gaio Mareta may have once been much the same figure in Iran as Indra was in India. Gawi or Gavi in Sanskrit means cow. Ritu in Sanskrit means death or murder. And in the Indo-European English language as the word murder itself. Thus, Gaio Mareta appears to be named cow murderer, just as Danu was symbolized as the cow goddess, whose worship is best known from Egypt, and Indra, her murderer. So Gaio Mareto may once have held this position in Iran. In the Pahlavi books of about 400 BC, it was written, from Gaio Mareta, Ahura fashioned the family of the Aryan lands, the seed of the Aryan lands. A later addition to Iranian mythology as we know it again appears to be a revival of the goddess religion. According to Iranian texts of the 4th century AD, the goddess Anahita was in charge of the universe. Curiously enough, they tell us that Ahura Mazda has given her the task of watching over all creation. The Hurrians, a ruling caste of Indo-Aryans. An earlier group of people who further explained the identity and cultural patterns of the invading northerners were known as the Hurrians. The greater percentage of Hurrian people were not Indo-European. At least they did not use an Indo-European language, but they were from an area either north of Anatolia or northern Iran and were a brachycephalic alpine group, as were the Indo-Europeans. It was perhaps in that area that they too were first conquered and then ruled by Indo-Europeans. These people, says Professor Saggs, long known in the Old Testament as the Horites or Hurrians, spoke a language having no recognized affinities except in the later Eurasian. They must have reached the mountains north of Assyria, presumably from the Caucasus region, in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. By 2400 BC, there was an isolated Hurrian settlement at Urkish in the Haber Valley west of Assyria. At this same time, at Nuzi and Telbrak, later to become important centers of the Hurrian kingdom, Hurrian names began to appear. Some were found as far south as Babylon, while by 2300 BC, Hurrian names appeared in the Sumerian city of Nippur, some 40 miles from Erech. Archaeologist O.R. Gurney wrote The Hittites in 1952. In this book, he suggested that the original homeland of the Hurrians was in northern Iran. He records that the Hurrian people are known to have spread gradually southward and westward from their home in the mountains region, south of the Caspian Sea, from about 2300 BC onwards, and to have become organized during the 2nd millennium into several powerful kingdoms, situated near the upper waters of the Euphrates and the Haber. Although most of the Hurrian people were not Indo-European, our interest in the Hurrians or Horites is based on the evidence that their kings and leaders were. Saggs explains that the kings of Mitanni bore not Hurrian but Indo-European names, whilst the old Indian gods Mitra, Varuna, and Indra were worshipped. All this points to the presence of an Aryan warrior caste ruling over a largely non-Aryan population. Gurney agrees, stating that Mitanni was ruled by a dynasty of kings whose names have an Aryan etymology, and Indian deities such as Indra and Varuna figure prominently in its pantheon. It is thus clear in Mitanni a population of Hurrians was dominated by a ruling caste of Indo-Aryans. The legend of Indra may have been known, since he is mentioned in the Hurrian tablets, but as yet no actual Hurrian accounts of the legend have been found. One Hurrian myth known through Hittite copies, though not a typical dragon story, revolves around the efforts to destroy Teshub, consort of the important Anatolian goddess Hapat, whom Hittite queen Peduhepa considered to be much the same deity as the sun goddess of Arena. The major protagonist is the god known as Kumarbi, whose religious center is listed as the early Hurrian settlement of Urkish. In this myth, he is called Father of all gods. His Aryan connections are visible in his name. Kumar in Sanskrit means prince. Kumarbi gives birth to a child made of stone named Uli Kumi, which is the name of a mountain in the Kizuwatna territory of Cilicia, in the south-central Anatolia, possibly the double-peaked volcanic mountain known today as Hassan Dagh. It is Uli Kumi's job to destroy Teshub. The text is quite long and involved and broken at many vital sections, but the major point is that Uli Kumi is told to suppress the city of Kumaya, to hit Teshub, pound him like chaff, and crush him with your foot like an ant. It is not certain, but the city of Kumia in the legend may refer to the city of Kumani, which was a major religious center of the goddess Hippat. The origins of the meaning of the name Hurrian, Horite, Horam may be associated with the meaning of the Iranian word Hara, or mountain. This word may survive in the German word for heel, or hohi, and the word for higher, hoher, possibly in the English word higher itself. This suggests that the Hurrians may simply be designated by the word mountains or hills, a description of their original homeland. It is also possible that the term was originally related to the Sanskrit word Harai, which means golden yellow. This word is generally associated with Indra, lord of the mountains, used to describe his bow, his horse, his sandals, and other symbolic possessions. It may even refer to the possession of gold, which in Sanskrit is Haran, later becoming oro in Latin. Or it's probably his yellow blonde hair. But to go even further, both of these groups of words may derive from an earlier idea of a golden mountain, the realm of eternal light, where the ancestors of the Aryans supposedly reside upon death. This image is most clearly presented in the later image of Ahura, in his glowing home on the top of Mount Hara. The Ubaid period: Eridu, Urartu, Ararat, and Arata. Along with these historically attested appearances of the Indo-Europeans from the middle of the 3rd millennium onward, there is the speculative suggestion that the Indo-Europeans are closely related groups, such as the predecessors of the Hurrians, may have entered southern Iraq as early as the 4th millennium BC. A group generally known as the people of the Ubaid culture, so called by archaeologists for the modern name of the site at which they were first noticed, Al-Ubaid, entered the Tigris-Euphrates area at this time. It is most often suggested that the Ubaid people came from the highlands of Iran, though some authorities are now beginning to believe that they moved down from the north of Iraq. Though it is uncertain, since there was no form of writing at that time, some writers suggest that the Ubaid people brought the Sumerian language with them. This language, neither Shemitic nor Indo-European, has long puzzled many language experts. Professor S.N. Kramer, who has done extensive work deciphering Sumerian tablets, suggests that Sumerian is reminiscent to some extent of the Ural-Altaic languages. Some of the areas in which these languages have been noted are just north and west of the Caspian Sea. It has been suggested that Arata, a place name often mentioned in Sumerian text, may be in that same area or just slightly south in the northwestern stretches of Iran along the Caspian Sea. From whichever direction their entrance was made, the Ubaid people seem to have established their major settlement in the town later known as Eridu, quite close to the junction where the Tigris and Euphrates joined with the Persian Gulf. These same people are known to have spread across the Tigris and Euphrates area. Millard tells us that as a result, the Halaf culture broke up, and at Arpakia there was destruction and massacre. The Ubaid people extended as far north as Lake Urmia and Lake Van. Close to the Iranian-Russian border, perhaps the area from which they originated as a more nomadic group, this section was later known as Ararat or Urartu, a name which may have been derived from Arata. It is possible that the name Eridu was once meant to remind its people of the name Arata or Urartu. Urartu was known in later periods to have been inhabited by the Hurrian people and at times is suggested as their original homeland. In about 4000 BC, the Ubaid people built a temple at Eridu. Those shrines to the goddess had been built in many Neolithic and Chalcolithic towns along the Tigris and Euphrates from 7000 BC onward. This temple at Eridu appears to be the first built on a high platform. Could this have been an attempt to simulate a mountain where there was none? Curiously enough, the Sumerian word for mountain is Hur or Kur. Unlike the other communities present in Iraq at that time, the Ubaidian temple of Eridu, not a single goddess figurine was found. The Maglemosian and Kunda people, who, as mentioned previously, seem to have been the cultural ancestors of the Indo-European peoples, used dugout canoes even in Mesolithic times. These boats are basically logs with holes burned out for the occupants. In earlier periods, these people were located in Northern Europe and Denmark. Two canoes, one in the Netherlands and one on the coast of Scotland, have both been attributed to the Maglemosian people. Maglemosian steering paddles, fish nets, and fishing traps reveal that these boats were used for fishing activities, apparently a major aspect of Maglemosian life. With rivers and streams that flow across Europe and the Near East, more numerous at a time closer to the melting of the Ice Age glaciers and pluvial rains that were still occurring in 10,000 BC, it may have been some of these ancient sailors, possibly over many generations, who eventually made their way to the warmer climate of Eridu. Evidence of the Maglemosians has also been found in Estonia, suggesting that they may have traveled down the Volga, which pours into the Caspian Sea. Many of them may have wandered into the numerous river inlets along the western edge of the Caspian into the Caucasus region. One of the major rivers, even today, that joins with the Caspian Sea is the Araks. Following the mainstream of the Araks would have led some of them into the Lake Urmia and Lake Van areas, that is, the land of Urartu. Branches of the Tigris and Urartu join up with the mainstream of that river, leading directly to the Persian Gulf, where the Tigris and Euphrates meets. Hawks tells us that on the Euphrates, the men of the Al-Ubaid culture were probably the first regular navigators of the river. A model found in a late Al-Ubaid grave at Eridu represents the oldest sailing boat known in the world. The deity worshipped at Eridu in historic times was known as the god Enki. In prehistoric periods, the god of this shrine appears to have been a fish or water god. Offerings of fish were burned on his altar. In historic times, Enki was thought of as a god of the waters, often described as riding about in his boat or simply called he who rides. This concept of the fish or water god is quite like one found in a fragment of an Indo-European Hittite tablet, which tells of a sun god who rose from the water with a fish on his head. It is also reminiscent of the sun god who was born from the cosmic waters supposedly released by Indra upon the deaths of Danu and Vitra. Though Enki is not generally designated as a sun god, in the myth of Marduk, he is named as Marduk's father, whereupon Marduk is called the son of the sun. The Ubaid people are credited with first developing irrigation canals in Eridu. Though these later salted up from the Persian Gulf, we may see the concept of irrigation canals as a natural idea for people who had lived their lives on rivers and streams, later settling in drier areas. Another possible clue to the identity of the people of the Ubaid period of Eridu is the institution of kingship and the mention of the name Alalu as the very first king of Sumer in the kings list of the earliest part of the second millennium. His residence was listed as Eridu according to these tablets, which appear to refer back to prehistoric periods. It was in the city of Eridu that kingship was first lowered from heaven. The name Alalu also occurs in the Hurrian myth of Kumarbi, which was previously mentioned. The Hurrian myth begins, in former years, when Alalu was king in heaven, when Alalu was sitting on the throne, though it is most often suggested that the Hurrian use of the name Alalu was based on the writings of Sumer, which are older, it is possible that this name remained in the memory of those Ubaidians who later sailed back to the area of Lake Urmia. Their presence there is attested by sites later than that of the earliest Eridu. It is perhaps in this way that the name survived in the Hurrian myths of the people who lived in that area. Sumer and Babylon, new people, new gods, and a revealing account of the murder of the goddess. Somewhere between 3400 and 3200 BC, another group of people appear to have entered Sumer. Professor Saggs writes of the manner of construction of a temple in what is known as the Uruk level 5 period as indicating the arrival of a mountain race familiar with the techniques of stoneworking. At this same time, the areas of Nippur and Kish began to develop as populated centers. At Nippur of historical periods, a god known as Enlil appears to have taken the limelight from Enki. In myths and inscriptions, we read of Enlil as the bright-eyed great mountain. His temple described as the house of the mountain, despite the fact that Nippur, in fact, most of Sumer, is no higher than about 600 feet above sea level. His introduction into the city of Nippur is associated mythologically with the rape of the daughter of the goddess in Nippur, Nun Barshigunu. The daughter's name is then given as Ninlil, and later she is described as Enlil's wife. Enlil was also known as Lord Air, a title also associated with a deity in Egypt, where the sign for the word air is a snail. In Hurrian myths, Kumarbi is associated with the town of Nippur. They claim that it's Kumarbi's town. In Sumerian tablets, we find the goddess under many names. In earlier times, each of these may have been revered as the divine ancestress of a particular community or town. Ninsikil was the patron deity of Dilmun, the paradise of the Sumerians, but it is also listed as an actual place in many records. Namu was known as she who gives birth to heaven and earth, as well as the mother of all deities. Nina was worshipped as the prophetess of deities. Nanshi of Lagash was she who knows the orphan, knows the widow, seeks justice for the poor, and shelter for the weak. On New Year's Day, she judged all of humankind. Nadaba of Erech, known as the learned one of the holy chambers, she who teaches the decrees, the great scribe of heaven. Shala, a title of Enini, described herself as mighty queen goddess who designs heaven and earth, am I. Ningal or Nikal, great lady, who is historical times was known as the wife of a moon god named Nanar, Sin in Akkadian. May at one time have been worshipped as the sun. In Anatolia, several high priestess queens of the sun goddess of Arena had the name Nikal as part of their names. 1 second.